We also were interested in just the simple things like what does it mean to have a fixed permanent exhibition and temporary exhibition. I don't know how many of you have gone to a museum with this big signpost which says, "We are sorry, but we haven't renovated our exhibitions for the last 20 years. Excuse us while we renovate." What does that mean to show an exhibition that is 20 years old?
The museum is more about the people who institute it than about the collections they exhibit. I think those temporalities are far more complex. For instance, the fact that the imperial collection may aim for a kind of completeness and universality implies that it tries to put the empire in an exceptional position, right? A position that justifies its dominant status versus traditional societies.
As archaeologists, you have to realize that we are not studying the past. We're certainly not studying in the past, we're studying the present. Archaeology is the study of the present, and then you have to specify what kind of present, and that gets him into one of his most remarkable concepts, I find, which is material memory. When we debate museum temporalities, we question not only practices of curating, but the museum as such.
We are faced with a number of questions, mainly, of course, how do you select these works? Which works are going to be selected? Who's going to be doing the selection? What do we mean by masterpiece? What is a masterpiece? Okay, masterpiece, Meisterstück, Meisterstück, chef d'oeuvre, capolavoro, obra maestra. We've got the word in each language. That we've got. The meanings have changed over time and also within linguistic confines, but there are three main meanings which are accepted. First of all, it's a test piece. What we now think of as a masterpiece within our museums isn't necessarily the masterpiece for the 16th and 17th centuries, which could be a lock, which could be a table, which could be... It's the piece of work which you submit to your guild in order to become a master within your profession. I think the crux of the matter is how far can we say that masterpieces identify with canon? Which thus means that we need to examine the importance of the canon when we're looking at 19th century museum culture and actually in contemporary museum culture. Over recent decades, the argument about the canon, about its formation and its use, and even its right to exist has been fierce, particularly in literary studies, but also in art history studies and in other branches.
What exactly happens when visitors encounter such provocative representations of human origins in museums? How do they make sense of them and integrate them into their identities? And what set of tools, whether pop cultural, intellectual, religious, racial, political, what have you, do visitors bring with them to exhibitions? And how do these things interact with what is being given to them? And so this is fundamentally where my interests lie, the cross-pollination between museums and other forms of enculturation. And in my experience, museums often try to insulate themselves from other media without addressing how influential the cultural stories external to the museum are to visitors' understanding of museum exhibitions, particularly stories that influence perceptions of visitors' own identity, heritage, and ancestry.
How do museums deal with the tensions between the past-oriented and future-oriented aspects in their work and missions? So museums are associated with the past, but their mission is also oriented to the future. They have the mission to preserve the collections for future generations and also making a relevant discourse for today. The anthropology of the past and the present attracts attention to the multiplicity of forms of presence of the past in our contemporary world. It is not only in discourses and histories, but also reconstitutions, monuments, categories, languages, eating practices, and so forth. If the museum is trying to address the contemporary world, it has to address the fact that the contemporary world is constantly changing. So this makes it difficult for the museum to be contemporary because, as he says, a major difficulty would still arise from the rapid changes now taking place in primitive cultures. How will we address contemporaneity? Let's call a contemporary artist. And it's a strategy because at the same time it is the museum, but it's also there is a claim of irresponsibility. The artist, we all know, is irresponsible.
How do you conserve a concept that is embedded in the material fabric of objects? How do you make sure that material considered sacred is treated with the respect it deserves? And how you can conciliate market trends, financial values, and artist's intention. Both indigenous and contemporary art or, of course, usually embedded in complex networks of meanings and values. Both fields are immensely broad, very difficult to define, and permeated by tangible and intangible productions. The collections are characterized by extensive ranges of organic and inorganic materials. In both cases, materials have been increasingly being replaced by modern counterparts, especially in the last few decades. On the exhibition's audio, I heard Kiefer saying that after he paints a canvas, he takes it outside his studio and he leaves it there for a couple of years. According to him, the painting continues to do its thing. So that is, it has to start deteriorating before he considers the painting ready for display. Does it matter if we stop the deterioration, so if we stop the decay? Another successful approach museums have found, as already suggested here, relates to the use of replicas, and more recently 3D scanning, imaging, and printing. Another example this time, Ai Weiwei. In the background, you can see him dropping some Neolithic pots of about 3,000 years of age. And then the other pots in the foreground, the also 3,000-year-old pots that he painted with industrial paint. In the same room there is Coca-Cola, and also From Dust to Dust, in which he went to extremes and actually crushed a collection of Neolithic vases and then put them in clear glass containers in a shelf. Perhaps he is alluding to contemporary values of authenticity and even asking collectors or museum visitors what is more valuable, so the antiquity or the hand of a contemporary artist like him.
When you enter the museum, you have all these objects containing bird parts, feathers, but also beaks, and some of them with a very long history, because the royal cabinets that are the source of the anthropology collections of France contained a lot of objects coming from South America, North America, or Polynesia, that have a lot of feathers in the objects. So there's a lot of problems for the curators to preserve the colors of these feathers and to think about the materiality of these feathers.
If there was a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Poland. But the last thing that Poland needed was a Holocaust museum because, in a sense, the entire country was already a Holocaust museum. Can the history of Polish Jews be saved from ethnography, and can history be purged of memory? That's the first set of questions that I'd like to explore. The second is, if you will, the value of process over matter. And I say that because, in large measure, all of East European Jewish culture has, at least in the popular imagination, been reduced to Fiddler on the Roof, to shtetl. And the last has to do with the approach that we've used in creating the core exhibition, which I would call a theater of history. And this really speaks to the convergence of two strands in the history of museums. One is the strand that comes from the history of collecting, that leads to cabinets of curiosity, that then leads to the systematic museum. But the other is a history of exhibition that develops from World's Fairs that also lead to the formation of museums, the Chicago World's Fair and the Field Museum being a classic example. And if you will, the first strand is very much in the vein of preservation, which is what we've been hearing about largely today, and material culture. But the second, in fact, is about experimentation and is, by its very nature, about exhibition and about performance. This is what the Warsaw Ghetto looked like after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. And so literally, the museum is created on the rubble. There are no historic buildings. We didn't start with a collection. What we started with was a story. And it's the story that really is the inspiration for the exhibition. It's the exhibition that sits at the heart of the museum. This is not the way museums normally think about themselves, or this is not the usual history of museums. Often museums start from a collection, and then you have the museum. Here, you have first of all the story, then the plan for the exhibition, then the establishment of the museum, then the architecture, and then the completing of the project. So it's a museum that was created from the inside out and created from the story.